Welcome back. In this segment, I want to tackle something that may seem a little bit controversial or sensitive. I've heard people say things like, well, I'm not called to overseas missions, or I'm not called to the nations. I'm called to do missions work here in our backyard, because the people here in the United States, they need to hear the gospel too. And that is correct. The people in your backyard absolutely need to hear the gospel as well. But I don't think there's a dichotomy between these two. In fact, I think it's a false narrative to say that we have to pick one over the other. The reality is I think it should be both and. You should be focused on doing great outreach in your local community, sharing the gospel with people that you interact with on a daily basis and on a regular basis in your life. And you should be regularly involved in global missions and Great Commission efforts. No Christian is off the hook in either one of these. Every Christian is responsible to be a part of both of these types of efforts. Jesus says in Acts chapter 1 that you will be my witnesses. And he begins to describe where we will be his witnesses. And he outlines locally, and then in the broader regions, and then to those who are supposedly your enemies, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. We are called to share the gospel with those who live around us, those who live in proximity to us, those who maybe we don't interact with regularly, but we have some influence over. We are called to share the gospel with those that maybe hate us, that view us as their enemy. And we are called to share the gospel, to propagate the gospel, to propel gospel efforts amongst all the people, amongst all the nations, and all the groups on planet Earth. No one is off the hook. All of us have this incredible mandate and obligation. Now, with that said, as I encourage you to consider local missions efforts and local outreach efforts in your community, in your backyard, I would encourage you to think about how you can utilize local outreach as a means to actually propel global outreach. One of the things that you can do is get people involved in local outreach to people that are different than the bulk of your local congregation. Let's say you live in an affluent suburb of a particular American city. And let's say your church is predominantly white, predominantly Caucasian. This is normative in evangelical circles. Now, in your particular city, probably within less than 20-minute drive, 25-minute drive or so, you can probably get to some place in the inner city of your city, so some urban neighborhood that is predominantly Hispanic, predominantly African American, or predominantly a minority group that is different than Caucasian. One of the things you can do to be a great mobilizer is get people in your church to go do missions efforts or do outreach efforts amongst those people groups in those neighborhoods to people that are different than yourself. When I was a local church pastor in Central Florida, one of the things we sought to do was to try to get our church heavily involved on the east side of town. On the west side of town where our church was located, it was predominantly white, and as you can imagine, our church was predominantly Caucasian. But the east side of town was predominantly Hispanic. There were a variety of people who were Puerto Rican, and there was a large influx of Brazilian immigrants. So every summer, we would have our church get involved in doing VBS with a local church there on the east side of town. This was sort of a way to get people who had never been involved in other cultures or any sort of cross-cultural efforts to get them involved to hang out with people different than themselves. We would have our people hang out on the east side of town for several hours each day, if not for multiple days in a row, to try to give them an exposure to a group of people different than themselves. And I would try to use this as a learning lesson on the importance of being involved in cross-cultural outreach. It's great to do cross-cultural outreach in our own community, in our own backyard, within our own state, but we want to then begin to challenge people to do global or international outreach efforts. And one of the great ways to get people involved on a global scale is to get them started on a local scale. If you are very creative and very strategic, you can get your people involved in local outreach. Doing great local efforts can really serve two purposes. It will minister to people in your backyard, and it'll help your people get more focused on doing cross-cultural efforts. And therefore, it can sort of serve as a stepping stone into getting them involved in global efforts on a regular basis. We want to encourage you, do great cross-cultural outreach in your community and use it as a means to mobilize people to do global efforts as well. In the next segment, we're going to talk about finances and how we as mobilizers can use funds to do great gospel efforts.